Take down your gate or face the committee. That's what Denise yelled across my front path on a Thursday morning while I was trying to drink my coffee and watch the mist burn off Pine Lake. I stood there on ground my grandfather leveled by hand, leaning on a post he sank into the earth before half these neighbors were even born, wondering how a simple wooden gate had suddenly become a public enemy. Nothing about it felt normal. Papers shoved into my hands. Photos taken at night. Rumors whispered on group pages about rules I never agreed to. It felt like I was being watched for doing exactly what my family has done for 60 years. Mind our land and leave everyone else alone. I work as a fire department technician, which means I've seen ridiculous paperwork in my life, but 8:30 that same Thursday morning I was holding the most absurd document yet, a notice of architectural violation on official-looking letterhead. The language was a mouthful. Gate installation restricts lakeside access standards, backed by multiple committee signatures and enough legal jargon to choke a courthouse. The irony, of course, was staring back at me from that same gate. Weathered iron hinges etched with my grandfather's initials, swinging on posts older than the HOA itself. I took a sip from my dented thermos and watched deer tracks disappear into the soft mud where the trail dips into the trees. The lake steamed in the cool quiet the way it has every morning for 30 years. The same lake my grandfather walked every dawn when he built this cabin in the 1960s. And now Denise Marshall, chair of the Mobility and Events Committee, wearing a neon vest that made her look like a lost crossing guard, was telling me that my family's property rights were a problem for her new, lakeside walkability plan. "Derek, I hope you understand this isn't personal," she said, tilting her clipboard like it was a badge. The Pine Lake Community Trail Initiative requires compliance with new accessibility standards. Your gate blocks community access to the lake trail system. She pointed at the simplest garden-style gate you've ever seen like it was a barricade across a freeway, ignoring the obvious. It's a boundary, not a wall. It's a polite reminder to hikers and weekend bikers that, hey, private land starts here. We have trails of our own. We also have friends and firefighters who know how to open a latch and keep moving. Architectural violation? I asked her. This gate has protected the cabin trail since before the HOA existed. Slapping lakeside access on a brochure doesn't erase pre-existing property rights. Denise, what authority do you think you have over structures that were here decades before your committee? She didn't flinch. She brought out glossy vendor brochures with polished photos of modern trail systems and smooth ramps carved into cities far from the pines. City Stride Solutions was the name on every page, stamped with buzzwords like accessibility compliance, barrier removal, professional installation, and price ranges that looked like a small-town budget request. She spread them across her car hood like she was dealing cards in a casino. The committee has partnered with professional consultants, she said, to ensure compliance with updated lakeside access requirements. These improvements benefit the whole community by providing safe, accessible routes to Pine Lake for all residents. I flipped through the materials, trying to keep my face neutral and my voice even. "So let me get this straight," I said. "You want me to take down my grandfather's gate so folks can cut across private property to reach a lake that already has public access through the boat ramp on the South Shore?" "We're not asking you to provide access through your property," she corrected, tone rehearsed. "We're requiring compliance with architectural standards that ensure community lakeside access isn't obstructed by unauthorized gate installations. The committee has determined your gate configuration violates those standards." She tapped the vendor packets page on barrier removal for emergency access, like she'd nailed her case. It sounds important until you remember emergency services never used these forest cabin trails for lake operations. That's what the paved South Shore boat ramp exists for. I handed back the brochures, and she stacked them with a little flourish like they were precious documents. "Okay," I said, swallowing a mouthful of coffee gone bitter. "I'll need proof that these bylaws actually apply to existing cabin properties. And while we're at it, I'd love to understand how the HOA gained authority over structures that predate its existence by 20 years. She checked her phone and adjusted the vest again, ready to leave. "You have 14 days to achieve compliance for lake season," she said. "The committee will be monitoring progress." And then, as if reading from a card, "I hope you'll consider what's best for the entire community. This initiative will enhance property values and ensure access for all our neighbors. I watched her drive away, then turned back to the gate like I was seeing it for the first time. The frame was sturdy, the planks darkened by age and weather, the hardware still solid after decades of rain and sun. It did exactly what it was built to do: keep strangers wandering off public trails onto private land while swinging open easily for friends, deliveries, and, yes, fire crews. But according to Denise and her vendor friends, it had become an urgent threat to lakeside access, a menace with a 2-week ticking clock. That evening, I went back to the violation notice on the porch, looking for any clue I'd missed. That's when I saw movement by the trail, light flashing, not a deer this time. Someone was out there with a flashlight, taking photographs, carefully positioning something that looked suspiciously like emergency gear. It was all being arranged to make it appear my gate blocked access to, what, exactly? The lake? The trail? If this were truly about community safety or emergency access, why stage photos in the dark like a crime scene? The answer landed in my inbox the next morning with a thud. Multiple neighbors forwarded posts from the community groups on social media, and there was my gate, front and center, surrounded by rescue equipment like a disaster zone. The captions were breathless. Cabin gate blocks emergency boat access, and trail obstruction prevents lake rescue operations. The lighting was dramatic. The gear was perfectly arranged. And none of it had been there until whoever had crept onto my property the night before staged it. I studied the photos carefully. The first one showed a row of equipment angled to suggest our friends at County Fire had reached an impassable barrier. Except that's nonsense. Any local knows lake rescue uses the paved ramp on the south shore. It's been that way for over 15 years. The county doesn't haul boats through narrow woods. That's why the ramp exists. So I checked the metadata. Timestamps put the photo session between 11 and midnight, right when I'd noticed flashlight beams. The geodata confirmed they were taken on my land without permission. Whoever staged those shots knew how to choreograph a crisis for maximum effect. It smelled like public relations, not public safety. I called the county fire department. The dispatcher sounded surprised I even had to ask. "Sir, Lake Rescue uses the South Shore boat ramp. We've never tried to access the lake through private cabin trails. We've had no blocked access problems." When I described the photos making the rounds, she said anyone using their name should probably call them before inventing emergencies online. Armed with that confirmation, I posted responses everywhere I could. "These photos are staged," I wrote. "Emergency services access the lake from the South Shore boat ramp and have done so for years. My cabin trail has never been used for rescue operations." I included the department's contact information so neighbors could verify it themselves, along with my own side-by-side images of the real emergency access road next to last night's contrived obstruction tableau. It didn't matter. The staged posts spread faster than the facts. "What if someone drowns because rescue can't reach the lake?" one person demanded. Others chimed in about how private property rights shouldn't override public safety, which is a neat soundbite until you remember public safety was never threatened and the boat ramp is a half-mile away and wide enough for trucks. Another neighbor implied I was choosing my antique gate over children's lives. That one burned. I documented everything. Photos. GPS coordinates. The paved access road laid out like a ribbon along the south shore, connected to the lake launch area where rescue boats actually deploy. Meanwhile, my narrow forest trail looked exactly like what it is: a private path on private land with a weathered wooden gate that opens if you lift the latch. It wasn't that people were malicious. They were spooked by a polished lie and reacted accordingly. But watching neighbors I've waved to for years share staged midnight theatrics as if it were breaking news made my hands shake. That night, just when I'd settled again, an unknown number texted, "Mr. Turner, this is City Stride Solutions regarding compliance documentation failure for your property. Our consultant needs to schedule an urgent review for architectural conformity. Please respond within 24 hours to avoid escalation." The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. We'd gone from committee notice to staged emergency access photos to a vendor company pushing an urgent inspection. It felt like a coordinated campaign, HOA overreach packaged as community safety, amplified by social media, followed by a professional ready to bring me into compliance. If you've ever wondered what HOA abuse looks like in a rural community, it often wears a smile and carries a clipboard. Monday afternoon, the consultant arrived, button-down shirt, khaki pants, clipboard stacked with forms. He carried himself like he'd walked this road 100 times, enough jargon and procedure to make a homeowner's eyes glaze over. He introduced himself as a certified cabin restoration specialist with City Stride Solutions and said he was there to conduct a mandatory architectural assessment for Pine Lake Historic District compliance. He spread glossy documents across my porch table and used words like non-conforming structure penalties. You would have thought my gate was a hazard to civilization. Historic district? I asked him. News to me. My grandfather built this cabin in the 60s. We've never been in a district of anything. He had a binder ready with references to architectural preservation standards and penalties for non-compliance, including forced removal and fines. He kept stressing penalties, as if repetition could make his threats real. I excused myself for more coffee and took my phone down the hall. It didn't take long to look him up. The license number on his card had expired 3 years prior, with no record of renewal. I also found a string of recent payments from City Stride to his personal consulting company, all tied to homeowner compliance projects. It painted a picture, a vendor claiming to be a neutral expert while profiting from scaring people into contracts. When I came back, he was photographing my gate and jotting non-compliant hardware notes. I tilted my phone and quietly recorded. It didn't take long for his expert talk to show some frayed edges. He had a good surface patter, but light questions made him stumble. His recommendations tracked perfectly with City Stride services, not with legitimate preservation practices. So I changed the script. You know what real historic preservation does? I asked, laying out my grandfather's old photos and the county permits from the 1960s on the table. It protects authentic features. It doesn't bulldoze them for trendy upgrades. I showed the camera the building permits, the original gate construction, the iron hinges with those carved initials. His confidence faded into careful hedging. Well, sometimes original structures do require modification, he said, but it sounded like a retreat. Then I slid a printout across the table, an email from the County Historical Society. There is no Pine Lake Historic District. None. If such a designation did exist, they added, it would almost certainly protect authentic mid-century cabin features like my gate, not demand their removal. He started packing his materials. I'll need to speak with my supervisors, he said. As he backed away, he warned me about cooperating to avoid escalation, like I hadn't already heard that line twice in 1 week. By dinner, I had a folder thick with proof, expired credentials, a non-existent historic district, payment records linking the expert directly to vendor sales strategies. Officer Lewis from the county took a look and shook his head. You've uncovered professional fraud here, he told me, but don't be surprised if they try to push this through the committee process next. Sure enough, on Wednesday a new email dinged my inbox. Joint Committee Action, Comprehensive Property Review for Pine Lake Community Standards. 3 committees, the Landscaping Committee, the Lake Management Committee, and Denise's Mobility and Events Committee, were coordinating to address non-compliant cabins and lakeside access obstruction. What began as one notice about one gate was now being framed as a community-wide crisis requiring a multi-committee response. They were trying to build a wall of authority through numbers. I attended the next landscaping meeting to see the machine up close. Denise sat at the head like she owned it, even though she wasn't a member. She guided the conversation toward architectural standards and used my gate as an example of how individual property decisions harm overall community aesthetics. The story was always the same: emergency access, lakeside walkability, community standards. The committees supposedly made independent decisions, yet somehow arrived at identical conclusions and vendor recommendations. Landscaping pushed visual consistency standards. Lake management argued property boundaries interfered with waterfront accessibility. Mobility and events insisted existing gates obstructed community circulation. The messaging was coordinated down to the adjectives. When it was time for public comment, I set a small recorder in front of me and read from the bylaws. "None of you have the authority to regulate pre-existing structures like mine," I said. "Committee coordination doesn't create new legal powers. It just creates noise." A couple of members glanced nervously at the device, and you could see the first ripple of doubt. They hadn't been given the law. They'd been handed talking points. Over the next day, I dug deeper into procedure and found a mess. Emergency votes were held without proper notice. Quorum requirements were ignored. The committees coordinated actions without board oversight, then waved around minutes claiming authorization that didn't exist. The kicker? The so-called board document authorizing joint committee action was missing key signatures. In some cases, the signatures that were there didn't match. That's when Rick Patterson, a neighbor handy with forensic document analysis from years in insurance claims, called to say what I suspected: the signatures were forged. Friday brought an email crowning the whole charade. Comprehensive Property Review Board meeting, final determination for Pine Lake Community Standards compliance. It was scheduled for the following Tuesday with minimal notice, a time when fewer people could show up. The authorization letter looked slapped together, and when I called the HOA office to confirm, the administrators sounded puzzled. The meeting wasn't on any official calendar. Rick dug in deeper. "Derek," he said that evening, "the signatures are definitely forged. And based on what I'm seeing, this has been going on for months. Not just for your gate. Multiple enforcement actions. Vendor approvals. Committee coordination. None of it was authorized." I looked at the folder with my grandfather's photos on top and thought about how quickly neighborly trust had been weaponized. If you were in my shoes, how would you restore fair process without tearing this community apart? One line only. Saturday I left the house at sunrise with a stack of documents and started walking. If fear spreads door to door, so can facts. I began with Tom and Linda Peterson, who've lived here since the 70s. I spread the real documents on their kitchen table, the bylaws that protect grandfathered property rights, the county statements about emergency access, the vendors' expired credentials. They looked at each other as if they just realized the ground under their kitchen had shifted. "We never knew our original construction rights were protected," Linda said, blinking back tears. Denise made it sound like everyone had to comply with new standards no matter what. By noon, I'd spoken to 6 households. The same confusion echoed across every porch. Mrs. Abbott worried she'd be forced to tear out her garden if she pushed back. The Johnsons thought their side yard didn't count because it wasn't part of the cabin structure. And a quiet couple at the far end of the lane showed me texts where Denise had told them any new workshop, even behind their grandfathered cabin, required full compliance with current rules. She said the board authorized enforcement across the board, Carlos told me, even on old properties. That's when Rick called with the bombshell. "It's bigger than we thought," he said. "The forged authorizations tie to vendor contracts. They've been using fabricated board authority to push enforcement and steer work to the same company. For months." By Sunday afternoon, a few of us gathered at the Petersons to put our cards on the table. Families shared their own violations and threats. One had been hit with a deck modification fine under emergency enforcement that didn't exist. Another had trees removed under hazard orders that had no board backing. The worst part? Some committee members in the room looked at the evidence and realized they had been unwitting participants in a staged process, pushed to vote on things outside their authority. By Monday evening, I'd organized a community meeting. 15 cabin families crammed into the Petersons' living room to sift through the stack of printed emails, minutes without signatures, and glossy vendor packets that now looked like props in a play. The mood was serious but united. People who had felt isolated in quiet disputes realized they were part of something bigger, a pattern of HOA overreach and procedural fraud. Tomorrow's board meeting wasn't going to be a polite chat. It would decide whether this community chose accountability or cover-up. That night, the county sheriff called. "Deputy Lewis, steady as ever, we've received reports of signature forgery and unauthorized governance activity within your HOA. State HOA oversight is asking us to investigate potential fraud tied to fabricated board authorizations. Can you provide your documentation?" Real authority, finally. The emergency board meeting Tuesday drew more residents than any HOA gathering I've ever seen. Folks who usually kept to themselves packed the community center, buzzing with a mix of anger and hope. It felt like a small-town town hall, the kind you see when something much larger than one property line is at stake. The board president, Mr. Chen, called the meeting to order with careful words about process concerns. He seemed to be trying to handle a live wire with oven mitts. I went first with a simple opening. This is bigger than a gate. Then we walked the room through it. Evidence of forged signatures on supposed authorizations, committee votes taken without proper notice, vendor contracts advanced without board approval, and a staged, emergency access, narrative used to whip up fear. We showed texts and documents. We showed timelines. We showed City Stride's expired license. We showed real emergency access routes. We showed how words like community safety and lakeside access had been turned into a battering ram against private property rights. A board member stared at the signature analysis under the projector's glow. "That's not my signature," she said, voice shaking. Another leaned forward with a mix of disbelief and dread. "They'd been used too." Then other families stepped up. The Johnsons described how they were pressured into approving major tree work based on fake emergency powers. Another family held up a violation notice for a deck built within their original footprint, flagged under grandfathered exception review that didn't exist in any bylaw. "We were told the board had already decided," they said. "Now we know that board decision was a forgery." Deputy Lewis arrived midway through, set a thick folder on the table and stated plainly, "We are investigating potential criminal fraud tied to HOA governance here. The State Oversight Agency requests that you preserve all records related to committee operations, vendor contracts, and enforcement actions over the last 6 months." That changed the air. This wasn't an internal squabble anymore. It was a matter for the law. The board couldn't defend what they never approved. Nor could they ignore what now had a case number attached. Chen finally dropped the euphemisms. "We are looking at systematic procedural fraud," he said. "We will vote tonight on measures to address violations and fully cooperate with law enforcement." Everyone looked toward Denise. For the first time all week, she didn't run the room. She sat in the back, arms crossed, glasses catching the fluorescence. When asked for a statement, she said she'd be retaining counsel and wouldn't be commenting. That was it. The board voted unanimously to remove her from all committee positions, void any enforcement action not backed by legitimate authorization, and begin notifying homeowners whose cases were tainted by fraudulent process. They also voted to hire independent counsel to protect the HOA from liability and to cooperate fully with the investigation. It felt like a reset button had been found and pressed with 2 hands. A week later, I stood beside my grandfather's gate while county inspectors bolted a small bronze plaque into the post. It read, "Pine Lake Heritage Property, Protected." The morning mist lifted off the lake like a slow curtain. The County Historical Society director handed me the paperwork. "Mr. Turner," she said, "your grandfather's cabin and its associated structures now have formal heritage protection status. The gate represents authentic 1960s rural construction. It is protected from retroactive compliance requirements." The state HOA oversight coordinator visited as well, bringing proposed reforms designed for rural associations like ours: verification for all committee coordination, signature authentication for enforcement actions, proper notice periods, and mandatory education about grandfathered property rights and due process. No more emergency votes without notice. No more committees inventing authority. No more vendor companies running the show behind the scenes. Deputy Lewis closed the loop with the part that mattered for deterrence: charges filed against Denise Marshall, signature forgery, fraudulent document creation, and conspiracy connected to governance fraud. Penalties included restitution for legal notifications to every affected homeowner and mandatory community service focused on HOA governance training. It sent the message rural homeowners need to hear: HOA fraud isn't neighbor drama, it's a legal issue with real consequences. But the real victory wasn't mine to hold alone. Families who had felt bullied now had certified protection for their grandfathered property rights. The committees received training to prevent future overreach. Vendor pipelines were severed from policy decisions. And my gate, this humble wooden gate built by a man who believed in sturdy hinges and honest work, became a symbol for something bigger than our path. We put up a small educational sign near the latch: Pine Lake Heritage, private property, respect and preserve. Not a wall. Not a barricade. Just a reminder that property rights and community values can live side by side without one being trampled by the other. Environmental Services confirmed what we'd said all along: private cabin trails here predate modern environmental regulations, and their grandfathered status protects them from retroactive impositions. The staged, emergency access claims that started this storm were quietly marked as misinformation. The county acknowledged publicly that lake rescue launches where they always have, from the South Shore boat ramp, and that private forest trails are not part of emergency response plans. We turned the lesson into a tradition. That fall, we organized the first Pine Lake Heritage Day. 20 cabin families gathered in golden light beneath the pines to celebrate what was always here but had never been formally named: our shared history as a community built by families who valued independence, neighborliness, and real stewardship of the land. We set up simple display boards with photos from the 1960s of cabins going up by hand, maps of the original footpaths, and a timeline explaining how grandfathered property rights work in a homeowners association. People walked the trail, read the markers, and talked to one another about how HOA governance should serve fairness, not fear. Kids put their hands on the old gate and learned how to lift the latch themselves. "This gate represents what we value," I told them near sunset, as deer stepped quietly to the waterline. Respect for family heritage, real property rights, and a community that chooses facts over fear. Looking back, it still rattles me how quickly a simple boundary became a battleground. A forged letter here, a staged photograph there, a sales pitch wrapped in accessibility and safety. It was a case study in how homeowners associations can overreach, how HOA abuse and misinformation can pressure families into giving up rights they didn't know they had. But it also became something else. A lesson in how to push back. Get the facts. Verify signatures. Document the truth. Talk to your neighbors. Involve the real authorities when process is being trampled. Every step of due process matters. If you live in a lakeside community or any neighborhood governed by a homeowners association, remember a few hard-won truths we learned at Pine Lake. Grandfathered property rights matter. If your structure predates the HOA or its modern rules, don't let someone wave a brochure and pretend time doesn't exist. Emergency access isn't a buzzword to be tossed in a caption. It's a plan, an actual route, and in our case, a boat ramp designed for it. Ask for the real emergency operations plan. Vendor partnerships shouldn't dictate policy. If a consultant shows up talking about penalties before they show you their current license, that's a red flag, not a service. Transparent community governance protects everyone. Notice periods, quorum, board oversight, and authenticated signatures aren't paperwork hurdles. They're guardrails against abuse. Most importantly, facts have a way of steadying even the most chaotic situation. When the noise grows, slow down and check the basics. We proved that one porch at a time. In the end, we didn't just keep a gate. We kept our voice. We protected a slice of real rural life that still matters in a world of glossy brochures and buzzwords. Denise tried to tear out a hinge and ended up proving why the hinge belonged there in the first place. Her campaign against one family's property turned into lasting protections for everyone's heritage rights, stronger HOA rules for transparency, and a reminder that truth is stubborn in the best way. Standing here now, I can hear the quiet tap of the plaque in the breeze and the gentle slap of water on the shore. The sky over the lake carries that late afternoon glow that makes the pines look like they're lit from within. The old iron hinge squeaks the way it always has. It's not defiance. It's memory.